Hello, everybody. This is Integrated Rhythm. Two swing dancing besties, that's Chisomo Selemani and myself, Bobby White, discuss race and other fun topics in the swing dance scene. I owe everyone a giant apology. It has been a while. There are some really good reasons why it's been a while. It's been a crazy time in these last few months for both Chisomo and myself, but ultimately the burden falls on me to have these out quicker, and I did a really poor job these last few months due to a few different stresses going on. So my apologies to you. I hope we can make it up with an incredible episode right now. Here is an hour-and-a-half long episode where we discuss the history of the Savoy Ballroom and get into lots of nitty-gritty fun details and thoughts about how our scene can relate to the Savoy Ballroom. So I hope you enjoy. Here we go! Chisomo is coming off of a sickness, and so she might not talk a lot, and her words might not be working.
Yeah, let's see. Oh, yeah, it's a little froggy. There it is. We have intermittent toad happening over here, so... But I have opinions. So.
Your toad is still one of the most melodious, angelic, speechified toady voices in existence.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
You know, in Ken Burns' jazz, they talk about how a lot of those guys would like try to go, as soon as they have a cold, they would just try to start sing like Louis Armstrong all the time. It was just there's a thing you did to sound like your hero, Louis Armstrong. Welcome to the 100th anniversary of the Savoy Ballroom. So I'm gonna tell Chisomo some fun stuff and some not as fun stuff about the Savoy Ballroom. We're gonna start off with just a quick understanding of New York City. If you're one of our listeners who doesn't know much about the layout of New York City, because the geography of New York City plays a prominent role in understanding the Savoy, and especially like in all the songs and a lot of the lyrics that you hear about the Savoy. So, for instance, New York City is 5 boroughs, and the main island, Manhattan is a long island that goes north and south-ish, and at the bottom is where kind of the Statue of Liberty is down near there. Is off the coast of the bottom. And you have the financial district, you have the villages, you have the number streets start a little bit down there, you have Soho, the shopping area, and then you go north and you have like lots of the big buildings, lots of big businesses, that kind of thing. And you have the theater district, and that's called Midtown. And the theater district is, as you can imagine, where a ton of the theaters are. That's where Broadway shows, most of them take place. And that's where, for instance, the Madison Square Gardens throughout the history of New York City have been either in the theater district or a little bit south where it is now on 34th near Penn Station. And so that's where the big hustle and bustle, and that is the downtown. When people talk about New York City and they say downtown, they are meaning the part that's below Central Park. If they're being super specific, they mean below Midtown. So you have downtown and Midtown. But in the history of jazz music, in the history of the Savoy Ballroom, you never hear the word Midtown. You only hear downtown and uptown. So that, for an important cultural reason, you'll understand in a few seconds. So then we have Central Park. And then above Central Park, you have the neighborhood Harlem. Some people think Harlem is a borough. No, it's considered a neighborhood, but it is above Central Park and below the Bronx. So you have Central Park, you have Harlem, and then a train would go over the river into the Bronx. By the way, the train famously that you would take to get to Harlem back in the day is the A train. You can still get there today. You can also get there on the 2-3. Point being, so Harlem is uptown, but in jazz music, in jazz history, uptown is Harlem, downtown is the rest of New York.
Yeah, I immediately had a number of songs come into my head. Obviously, most famously, Ella's A Train. The idea is, if you want to go to Harlem, which
Yep,
is an
yep.
A train. It is fun. It's a fun song. Go downtown.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, yeah.
So there's the songs about going uptown and downtown. Yeah.
By the way, the Nike Air, the white Nike Air tennis shoe, famous tennis shoe from the 1970s, 80s, 90s, that is called Uptowns, or their nickname is Uptowns because they were famous among the black men and women of Harlem. So the history continues. If you take anything away from this, the history continues, whether you know it or not. I'll very quickly give an incomplete list of batshit stuff that proves NYC was not a progressive promised land as much as some people might think. So this is AKA the downer part of our talk today. But in the 1860s, during the Civil War, I'm sorry, y'all, New York City was kind of vaguely pro-Confederate. So much that they threatened to leave the Union. One of the reasons for this is because New York City is a financial capital of the United States. And if your country's biggest source of money is slavery, and then your financial center is tied pretty dramatically to that institution. In 1863, the draft riots happened in New York City. Basically, they were drafting, a lot of them were immigrants fresh off the boat. You got to America and they said, here, congratulations, you're an American now. Here's a rifle, go fight for the Union. And in 1863, a famous draft riot broke out in New York City, and a lot of black Americans were killed in the city. They were maimed and killed as part of the protest that these people had of not wanting to be drafted to fight for the Union. So here's an interesting thing about Harlem is that Harlem was not always a black American community. There's a long history of different communities that moved in and out of Harlem. In the 1800s, it was predominantly Jewish, and Italian Americans started coming in the early 1900s. Jewish Americans and Italian Americans. Interestingly, the Jewish Americans preferred black Americans to the newly immigrant Italian Americans. And so the Jewish Americans created this system to get middle-class black Americans to rent houses in Harlem because they preferred to have black Americans, middle-class black Americans as neighbors than newly fresh immigrant Italian Americans. And also they knew that the black Americans would make the newly immigrant Italian Americans not stick around in the neighborhood very long because of all the complexity of, modern day racial and class situations involved.
Yeah, I think it's also important to remember that at this point in time, technically none of these communities was considered white, right?
Exactly.
So, yeah.
The thing that happens is that black Americans take them up on the offer for higher rents, by the way. So the middle-class black Americans are paying more to live there than white folks would pay to live there. But it is successful enough that it becomes too successful for the likes of a lot of the Jewish American families who decide to move outside of Harlem, the more black Americans come in. And the Italian Americans move outside of Harlem, and the Puerto Rican community that starts to make their way in. And so you have the flight of some communities with the influx of other communities in Harlem, specifically the black Americans and the Puerto Rican communities.
I wanted to hop in here really quick, and we've so far kind of like not painted the Jewish community and the Italian American community in Harlem in the most favorable light right now. And so I actually wanted to give a counter example that once Lindy Hop becomes really big and grows in New York City, a lot of the folks who are doing it who are non-black are Jewish and Italian Americans. In fact, it makes up a large number of the folks who are doing this social dancing form, and it's spreading like wildfire. They're the ones that are passing on their stories to us. They're the ones that are entering the Harvest Moon Ball. So we just know that the dance was really big in the Jewish and Italian American communities.
So another thing that famously happens that you probably know about, folks, is the Great Migration is 1900s. Many, many black Americans are driven out of the South because of lynching, increased Jim Crow laws, predatory sharecropping contracts, industrial jobs being available up in the North, and the promise of close-knit Black communities. One thing I always try to remind people in my talks is that the Great Migration was 40 years after the Civil War. It's not like the Civil War drove out these Black Americans. No, it was the 40 years after the Civil War. It was all that stuff that they had to put up with, which I just mentioned, that they didn't want to leave. The South was their home. That's where all their families were. That's where all their friends were. They knew everybody there. They knew the seasons. They understood. If they were farmers, they knew how the ground worked. They didn't want to leave the South. They were forced out of the South when the pressure, for all those reasons, just became too much. It was miserable to live there.
All right, I wanted to hop in yet again. I talk about the Black Americans coming from the South. The people I failed to mention adequately enough to Chisomo is the Caribbean American community, the Black Caribbean community coming up as part of the Great Migration as well. They are actually, Charles Buchanan is Caribbean, Norma Miller is Caribbean, Sonny Allen is Caribbean, and many of these other Black Americans in Harlem and dancers that we know do have Caribbean roots. So the Caribbean community was also a really important part of Harlem growth at this time.
And so they moved northern cities, Harlem being one of the biggest. Harlem became known as the Black Mecca. Harlem was also called the Big H and the Inward Heaven. So Black entertainment is just so important to America, American arts. Throughout its entire life, Black entertainment has been a huge part of American art and culture. For instance, we have minstrel song and dance coming from the Civil War and post-Civil War era. In the 1910s, 20s, and 30s, the jazz era, you've got jungle music, aka, like the savage / sexual stereotype of Black sensuality. You've got blues that's coming up in the 1900s. And so there you have the soulful, depressive, but making the best of your horrible situations, heartfelt juke joint style music. And then you have your ragtime, your syncopated music, your jazz. Harlem, because it becomes such a very large, important Black American community, is also a huge space for Black American arts and culture. And so you have all these clubs. You have this amazing entertainment district. And the clubs become so popular that they have hop-on, hop-off buses. They take you to the museums. They drive you all around. You just hop on, hop back on. It's a way for tourists to see all the fun stuff. So they had hop-on, hop-off buses that would take white folks from downtown all the way up to Harlem and take them around to all the clubs and then drive them back downtown. And probably most of our listeners have probably seen the famous Nightclub of Harlem map, where E. Sims Campbell did that beautiful illustration of all the clubs around Harlem, and there's lots of fun, cool insider information. It's like a local's guide to all the cool stuff that's happening. Now, they had 3 big clubs in Harlem. They had the Cotton Club, which was whites only, Black entertainers, and the food was apparently expensive and bad. They had Connie's Inn, which was whites and, quote, high yellow, quote, folks only. So you had to pass for white or be so light-skinned that... Yeah. They did not have food. Then you had Small's Paradise, which was all welcome. So Black and white mixed. They also had mixed entertainers, and they apparently had really good Chinese food. Now, what's important to know about the clubs is these clubs in Harlem, a lot of them are white-dominated spaces. Their Cotton Club is literally whites only, but you have a lot of places that are catering to the tourist trade. And so you have a lot of whites only or whites and light-skinned folks only kind of stuff. Let's talk about the Cotton Club really quick. In my talk that I gave at Lindy Focus, this slide was called the Effed Up Cotton Club. The Cotton Club looked like a plantation house in the South. That was the stage for the Cotton Club. Is a plantation house. And the walls are painted with scenic southern cotton tree plantation stuff.
Yikes.
Yeah. I was in my 20s when I found out why they called it the Cotton Club, and I felt like I grew up in the South, and I'm like, oh, I should have realized that immediately that's why they call it the Cotton Club.
Oh, no. Oh, yeah.
They famously have the paper bag test for their chorus girls, where, you had to be lighter skinned than a paper bag in order to qualify.
Yeah, and that continued to be a marker in entertainment, even for TV. Yeah.
They discouraged dancing because if you were dancing, you weren't drinking, which we Lindy Hoppers, we all know that.
Mm-hmm.
If you're dancing, you're not drinking. It was still considered the top performance space for Black entertainers. Frankie Manning thought he had made it when he performed at the Cotton Club. People asked him, he had missed one of the film clips that they were filming. It might have been Day at the Races. Anyway, he missed one of the Whitey's film clips they were filming, and people said, aren't you bummed you didn't appear in that film? And Frankie was like, no, I was performing at the Cotton Club. That was at the top of the game. That was the proudest thing. You get the sense of the pride that he had in performing at this space. So the Cotton Club moved downtown. So it was originally in Harlem. It moved downtown during the 1935 race riot that happened in Harlem. And if you want to learn more about that race riot, you can go to Swung Over and check out the 1935 Harvest Moon Ball essay, because the race riot and the Harvest Moon Ball having its first year is this really fascinating combination of culture and it really speaks to the times that these two events happened really close to each other.
It really does. It's also how art can be used to help deflect from social unrest.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's wild.
All right. So then we have 3 big ballrooms. Now, the ballroom spaces, which are the communities, the Black American communities' personal dance spaces. So you've got Alhambra, which had all age dances, and that was kind of like Frankie Manning always called that elementary school. You had the Renaissance Ballroom, aka the Rennie, and that was called high school. So that's where if you were under 18, that was where the high schoolers and stuff would go to dance. And then, of course, you have the Savoy, which we're going to talk about right now, which was the highest regarded. It was considered graduation. So Savoy Ballroom opens March 1926.
100 years.
So the Black community didn't have a ballroom that was as grand as the Roseland Ballroom downtown. The Roseland Ballroom was a whites-only giant ballroom downtown, and it was the big fancy ballroom space. So in Harlem, interesting enough, it was the Roseland owner who apparently first had the idea to do the Savoy, that they wanted to do a big, classy ballroom in Harlem. And so he was looking for business partners. He found Mo Gale, a Jewish businessman who didn't really know much about dancing or didn't do much dancing. And Mo Gale knew Charles Buchanan, a Black businessman who understood ballrooms, he understood folks, he understood the entertainment industry. And so those 3 went together to create the Savoy. And then eventually the Roseland guy sold his share to Mo Gale and Charles Buchanan. Mo Gale and Charles Buchanan were the forces behind it. I've seen references that Charles Buchanan was a partial owner, not 50-50, but was a partial owner of the ballroom. I think later another time. But sometimes people were like, oh, was Charles a co-owner or was he just a manager? I might be wrong about that, but I seem to recall.
It was like a semi-Black-owned business.
So we're going to kind of get to know the Savoy better. I'm going to start reading some stuff from this thing called Swing by Christian Batchelor. So Christian Batchelor was a scholar, a swing dance Lindy Hop scholar in the late 2000s. I think he's now a Pokemon scholar. I kid you not. I think he switched over and did some other stuff in his life after he wrote this really giant, huge book that's actually just a really, really good source. Out of all the information, there's a few things that have not stood up to the test of time, almost certainly because he didn't have the research that we have now. So we have, in some ways, a few more accurate pieces of information. We got the newspaper archives online. We've got a lot of ways to kind of like update our information that he didn't have, but it was a fantastic book at the time. And it's got tons of great information that still totally holds up, which we're going to talk about now. So here we go in the Savoy Ballroom. All right, so it was named after the Savoy Hotel in London. They were like, what's a fancy thing? Oh, the Savoy Hotel in London's fancy. We'll call it the Savoy.
Oh.
That'll give that fancy vibe that we're looking for.
Wait a minute. How did I not? I always thought that the Savoy in London was named for the Savoy in New York. Anyway.
So there were two bandstands side by side. Sometimes people get misled into thinking that the bandstands were on either end of but I've never seen a picture where that's the case. And every research I've seen on it points to the bandstands being side to side, which makes sense for your auditory equipment and stuff like that. And you don't need to have two pianos. You just have one piano if you have two stages side by side. And the other thing is that the Savoy famously had continuous music. And what that meant is it didn't just mean that once one band stopped, the other band started again. It literally meant that the band would finish their last song of their set. And while they were playing the last song, the new band would pick up and join them in playing the last song of their set. They would just do this over and over and over again. They had like 30-minute sets back in that time. And yes, apparently they had lots of colorful lights and spotlights. So I think that was maybe a new thing at the time, to have lots of fun lighting for your venue.
And the side-by-side theory makes a lot of sense if you need band leaders to communicate to each other for those transitions, right? Yep. So if you're at opposite ends of the room, that's basically impossible. But if you're standing next to each other, that's,
So the building was likely 200 feet by 70 feet, which is the standard size of that block. They say the Savoy took up a block. And so someone I saw had located the actual size of that block and measured it out. And so probably 200 feet by 70 feet, which is long and thin. And the dance floor itself was even thinner. So the dance floor was most likely like 120 feet by 25 feet based on the diagram.
That's not very deep at all. And I've seen
this. It's not very deep.
I saw the diagram and I was thinking like, it's rather narrow.
Yeah. One of the cool things are, folks, if that seems really small to you, if you look at pictures of the Savoy Ballroom, 25 feet is actually pretty big for, if you're filling up the space.
Yeah. It's 5 of me across. It's 25. That's about it. So I guess that, it's not too bad. But I mean, I think you had posted something in comparison to like the Lindy Focus ballroom floor.
Yeah.
We're spoiled with these massive ballrooms, right? Yeah.
And the Savoy was thought to be a giant ballroom at the time. So even though it might appear small to us, it was still big relative to...
it's still a city block. Like it's still...
Now, if you're inside the ballroom, you've got booths and stuff surrounding the dance floor, and there's a few entrances to the dance floor. And there's almost like, because of the booths, there's almost like a railing around the dance floor. And because there's a railing around the dance floor, and there's booths around half of it, and then the other half is the band. And a bunch of dancing at this time wasn't just Lindy Hop. It was a lot of classic partnered dances, one-steps, Peabodys, that kind of stuff. Yeah. And a lot of those dances moved in the line of dance. They moved in a big circle around the dance floor. And so the Savoy quickly got the nickname The Track because it looked like a racetrack. It looked like just like racehorse tracks or that kind of stuff. You have your audience on one side. You have the railing fence going around. So that's why it's called The Track.
Everything you're describing about it makes those clips from inside the Savoy make a little bit more sense too, because it seems like the jam circles that you see are really packed in. And
so the corner was on the 145th Street side. So if you're looking at the bandstand, they had the main bandstand, and next to it they had a slightly smaller bandstand right next to it. That would provide psychological warfare because Chick Webb would be on the bigger bandstand. And when he would do battles with Count Basie or Benny Goodman, they had to be on the smaller bandstand. And then the Cat's Corner is on the left side of the main bandstand. So the corner where the railing is up against the end of the dance floor, in between the main bandstand and the steps out of the dance floor or the ramp off of the dance floor.
So that is, I always, when I started swing dancing, I never understood why every dance floor I go onto, all the good dancers were on the left side of the DJ booth, or on the left side of the stage. I didn't understand it. And then at some point discovered Cat's Corner, left side, Savoy, and here we are today. Always on the left.
So, super geek out fun fact. The second, third, fourth, fifth generations of Savoy dancers, as far as we know, they called it the corner, not the Cat's Corner. And so the question is that something that the modern era made up, or someone along the way just made it up? According to Henry Heinella, dance scholar, Lindy Hop scholar, the first generation, Shorty George's generation, might have been calling it the Cat's Corner. And it might have something to do with the fact that not just because cat was a popular term for a person who loves jazz.
Cool kid, yeah.
Their Lindy Hop group were sometimes described as cats, like the Wildcats or the Harlem Wildcat, that kind of thing. Don't quote me verbatim on that name, but that's the gist, is that his group, that group of hotshot dancers was known as
cats. The cats are over there. The cats are in the corner.
Yeah.
That's the Cat's Corner.
That's the Cat's Corner, yeah.
I see. It was an adjective describing the people who were in the space. And then after those people left, they're like, that's the corner.
Yeah. It was indeed integrated now it's not the first integrated dance space in America or New York. And the other thing important to know, listeners, is that it's not like it was half white and half black folks there. It was still a black space. When people talk about the estimates of how many white people were there, it was still 15, 20% non-black folks at the Savoy on most main nights. The time that was mainly different was on Saturday nights. Saturday nights was Squares night. That's the night when all the tourists came up and the tourist buses and stuff were moving and stuff. And so that is a night that might have been half white, half black. And in fact, when you see some of the videos of most of the footage we get of the Savoy Ballroom are from special occasions, like the Harvest Moon Ball prelims or the famous Lindy Hop, famous to me. There's the famous Lindy Hop contest clip from 1933 of the first generation dancing in the Savoy Ballroom. Check out that 27 seconds. In those clips, you can see the audience has a ton of non-black people in it. But that was only the case on the weekend nights. But the Saturday nights, that's when they had the Lindy Hop contests. Again, yes, they're for the culture. They're also for the tourists. That's when they had the Big Apple performances, when they performed the Big Apple every weekend. So Saturday night was when they busted out all that performance stuff.
And there's something to be said about the performativity, the performance nature of what we know to be Lindy Hop and how we came to know it and who was observing, this makes me think about whose gaze was important and yeah. It's they're performing for the white gaze on Squares night, and then that's captured. Sorry.
Chisomo Selemani. I'm going to jump ahead.
Did I spoil?
No, this is awesome. This is what we're here for. All right. So this is a paragraph from Christian's book. The black middle class was not keen on the ballroom, the dancing taking place there, or for that matter, swing in general. Quote, Harlem's social set looks down on the Savoy, unquote, wrote Life magazine in 1936. According to Langston Hughes, the dancers began to practice acrobatic routines and to do absurd things for the entertainment of whites that probably never would have entered their heads to attempt merely for their own effortless amusement. Some of the Lindy Hoppers had cards printed with their names on them and became dance professors teaching the tourists. Isn't that an interesting little opinion from Langston Hughes,
Man.
father poet of the Harlem Renaissance?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, growing up, I was such a huge Langston Hughes fan. But that's the thing about growing up in a Black academic household. You get exposed to these incredible thinkers. The thing that you realize as you become a Black academic is how stratified society is, and like you start hating on other people's game, and so like, wow. I feel like I see in such vivid color the things that we experience in the Black community. Some people are, these dancers are out here. They're hustlers. To understand the original Lindy Hoppers is to understand the mind of an artist and an entrepreneur. So I think it's important for us to have that lens of
you can't express yourself without food and bed.
Yes. And so, of course, they had their names on cards because they're like, yeah, we can teach you too, because it's a hustle. And then what's wild is then you have like 80 years later, like 70, 80 years later, people being like, oh my gosh, look at this. This is how normal life was. It's like, yes and no,
Yeah.
Anyway. Okay.
Here's the weekly schedule for the Savoy Ballroom. On Mondays was Ladies' Night. All women get in free. Tuesdays was the 400 Club. So the 400 Club was basically the hardcore dancers. Anyone could sign up for it and pay the membership fee, but you only signed up for it and paid the membership fee if you cared enough to pay that kind of money to go dance at the Savoy when there weren't a whole lot of other tourists around. And some fun stuff is the initiation ceremonies were different. There's different accounts of different initiation ceremonies, so it might have changed over the years, that kind of thing. But one of them was like all the women have to do that thing where you put your head against a bat on the ground and like spin around and get really, really dizzy. And all the men had to there was a lineup of men and the men had to crawl through their legs while they got spanked in the behind, silly stuff. But I actually just recently did an interview with a 99-year-old Jewish American woman who visited Savoy often, and she was a member of the 400 Club. Her name is Irene. She's awesome. And she mentioned that when she went there, her initiation was to be thrown around by the Whitey's Lindy Hoppers. And so this is she's like a 16-year-old girl. And so she just got thrown around, which we don't condone, folks. Don't throw people in random air steps out there. She had the time of her life. It's one of the best times she ever had. And she said that was the only time she did air steps. It's not like she went and continued working on them or anything, but that was a fun story from her life.
I feel like you needed to have fine print scrolling across the screen. Do not try this at home or in your local ballroom or with anybody you don't know and haven't practiced many, many hours with. So I need to know who she was thrown by, though. Who?
Oh, she didn't know the names. She just knew that the Whitey's Lindy Hoppers were there and they chucked her around in air steps.
Just here.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
If I recall correctly, this was during World War II. And so I think a lot of the folks that we would have known might not have been there.
Gone. Okay. That makes sense.
I threw some names at her and she couldn't remember any of the folks that I mentioned.
It also makes sense. You're a 16-year-old high on adrenaline.
Yep. Yeah.
You have these young, handsome boys who are just tossing you in the air and catching you, and you're like, sure.
I mean, I was 16. I would have done lickety split, no problem.
Listen, I hear you. All of our prefrontal cortexes were not developed.
Your body's made of rubber.
Yes.
You bounce back in 10 minutes if something feels weird.
You do. Yeah. I remember climbing this chain link fence when I was 18 with friends. Why? We wanted to go into a park. Why not? So yeah, I hear you.
Another fun story about the 400 Club is you got a ring. And the ring was how you got your special 10-cent admission in to the dance that night or whatever. And so there was this one group of dancers who one kid walked up with the ring and then he went inside, went up to the bathroom and dropped the ring out the window to his friend who was waiting outside, who would go in. And so that was one of the stories about getting in. By the way, one of the great things about Christian's book, folks out there, is that he had lots of interview stuff from Al Minns and Frankie Manning. But one of them is that during the famous Battle of the Bands with Benny Goodman and Chick Webb, obviously, he says that Frankie and his friends sent folks to the back door at the top of the Savoy, like the fire exit door. They sent people to the fire exit door and charged them less and pocketed the money.
Entrepreneurs.
Surviving in this crazy life. I imagine Whitey might not have been excited if he found out about that. Maybe he never did.
Yeah.
Because Whitey worked for the ballroom.
We need to recognize that hustle is a word for brilliance. Brilliant people. Anyway,
so it was famously a place that you wanted to dress up to. So you wore really nice clothes. Harlem itself, folks, had a very high dress code, especially on Sunday mornings when you would walk down the avenue in your church clothes. And at the Savoy. And so like it was very common. People wore suits to the Savoy, and then you sweated through those suits because there was no air conditioning. But you didn't take off the suit. You didn't take off the coat. You wore a soaking wet suit. And Frankie Manning famously went through 3 suits on the night of the Benny Goodman battle. He wore a suit, drenched it, went home, changed, wore a fresh suit, drenched it, changed.
Wow. And here, folks, we have a couple lessons. One, look at these gentlemanly humans who were like, you know what I'm not going to do? Be totally soaking wet for somebody else. I will feel that sweat. I will be uncomfortable, or I will change. Changing is always favorable. And then 2, if you don't already know, Black people like to look good. Black folks around the world, we like to dress. So if you see somebody in a movie not dressing, not looking great, it's usually because it's a storytelling device. And I just want you to think what story they're trying to tell. All right, next.
So famously, the dance floor of the Savoy. A dancer from every different generation mentioned how much it bounced. Hence the phrase bouncing at the Savoy. Like the dance floor bounced. So if you don't know how sprung floors work, folks, we have, if you just stacked some wood on a floor, there's no space between the wood and like the concrete foundation, let's say. So that would be, there's no spring whatsoever in that floor. That's just a piece of wood on the concrete. Now let's say that you wanted to put that on some cushioning. And so back in the day, your main cushioning was like a lattice framework, right? Think of like you put a lattice fence down, and then you put the floor on top of that. And now there's a little bit of bounce because there's a little bit of air in the space between the floor and the concrete foundation. Now, if you engineer it right and put your lattices in very specific places, you will never have a spot that is just wood. You will always have air somewhere in the chain between the wood floor and the concrete foundation. And so back in the day, a sprung dance floor meant that you had like a lattice situation, so there was always air under the floor panels. Now, I don't know if the Savoy had a special, I don't know if they just went all out and just like really nailed this sprung floor thing, or if like it was the nature of a Black American community dancing to jazz music and everyone just kind of moving and grooving as one into the floor that might have made it feel just particularly bouncy. But like they always, like all of the old timers mention how bouncy the floor was as like a heavenly aspect of the Savoy. Please note, this is the way sprung floor was described to me by someone who studied them and installed one. According to the internet, there are apparently other techniques or variations. In an interview, Al Minns described the Savoy floor consisting of 3 layers: the dance floor, then spring, then cork. In this case, the spring could refer to the wood lattice system and cork to being the somewhat absorbing substance that the spring system rested on, which makes sense based on some diagrams I've seen. I've tried to find out how slidey the Savoy Ballroom floor was because in the Spirit Moves footage, it looks pretty slippery. they're doing all these cool slides and stuff, and no one's really hunkering down, as if they might slip out from under themselves if they hunker down too much. And I could never get a very clear answer, mainly because when I would ask Sonny Allen this, or when I would ask Sugar this, they say, oh, that floor was bouncy. So like, it's like they didn't care how slippery it was. That was the important thing, was that floor moved with you, and that you moved with the floor.
Yeah. I think further emphasizing the importance of groove, right? What we talk about is groove, like this rhythm. Everyone's moving together in rhythm, this groundedness idea, this thing that,
Wednesdays and Fridays were private functions and social clubs. We're going to come back to that one. Thursdays was kitchen and mechanics night. So a special deals for laborers. I don't know how much they knew the Savoy Ballroom was going to be a tourist spot when they created it. Like, on the one hand, they're in a tourist entertainment district mecca. Like, they're in the spot with the Cotton Club, Small's Paradise, Connie's Inn. They're in the place where, like, if you're interested in black music, you go to this area and party. But one thing that strikes me is how much the ballroom does seem geared towards its community. So, for instance, you have, the ladies' night. So women get in free. You have the hardcore dancers night, like, they're not catering to tourists on the 400 Club night, or maybe they are, but it doesn't seem like it. Like, that's like special membership for hardcore dancers. You have your kitchen mechanics night, right? That's day laborers. Like, you're not catering to the downtown tourist market by having your kitchen and mechanics get in discount night, right? And then on Wednesdays and Fridays, they have the private functions and the social clubs. And this is where, like, if y'all go and look up pictures of the Savoy Ballroom, sometimes you'll come across some, like, pretty crazy, cool, in a cool way, pictures of the Savoy Ballroom. Like, you'll see a bunch of people in, like, cowboy hats, or you'll see drag queens. You'll see half nude artistic dances happening. And a lot of that is the nights for the private functions, the social clubs. So your urban league would put on a fundraiser. Your local community Black American business would do its annual holiday party at the Savoy. Like, this was a place where the community could come together and celebrate whatever they needed, whatever they wanted to celebrate.
Yeah, it seems when you were setting this up and you were talking about the clubs, it seems like the club spaces were kind of like the adult spaces, the working spaces, the spaces where, like, it seems like the Black community was always on. Like, thinking about the Cotton Club, whoever's there is always on. You are performing, you're there to be seen. There's an understanding of that. But even thinking about how Frankie described each of the ballrooms being like elementary school, high school, and like graduation, that seems community. That seems like home. It doesn't seem like a place where you'd expect to be watched, to be observed. You go to kick it with your people. So to your point, there is that question of like, were they ever, and then ballrooms were in every community, right? So people were doing the foxtrot, were doing the Peabody and all of that, and like all everywhere. And if you went to any city, in Cleveland, we have old ballrooms. Those are community spaces. So it is interesting. Like, I think that question is very valid. Like, was there ever the consideration that this would become like a prime gathering space for people who are outside of the community?
On Saturdays, that definitely happened, because that, as we mentioned, was Squares Night. When the tourists came up, did I mention it was called Squares Night?
You did.
Okay.
It's hilarious because
it's pretty hilarious. On Sundays, they had dancing all day and all night. And once a month, they had breakfast dances, which went until 8 a.m.
Oh, breakfast, because you danced until breakfast.
So average admission during the Savoy era was 40 cents. So that's $8. $8 to see Chick Webb play live. And you get to stay there for like 8 hours overall in the space or something like that, or it closes at 3 a.m. And you're probably getting there at 8 p.m. maybe if you wanted to get there super early.
Oh my God. $8 in today's dollars.
$8 in today's dollars.
That's
Isn't that crazy? I mean, based on the national federal inflation calculator that I used, the 400 Club night was 10 cents. That was your discount. So that was $2. You got to dance for $2 as part of the 400 Club. You also had to pay the membership or whatever. A star-studded band night was 50 cents, $10. You would see Count Basie for $10 in today's money. $10.
The thing is, like, I'm trying to think of an artist equivalent. The artist equivalent that keeps coming to mind is Beyonce. It's like Beyonce and Taylor Swift and all these people. But like, wow. That's incredible.
Isn't that?
It is.
Isn't that?
It's wild.
And by the way, folks, I'm not skilled enough in economics to know exactly the reasons why all of that is, why it would only cost. I mean, maybe supply and demand is some part of it, like this was the popular dance form. And so you could see the Savoy band tonight, who you could see there every week, or you could go to these 20 other clubs in Harlem who also have these bands and other experiences and stuff. Maybe it was just such a rich supply and demand. I don't know. They did a Big Apple contest with a $50 prize. That $50 prize is $950. So you would pay $10 to get into the night, and then you could possibly win $1,000 for a Big Apple contest win. They gave out like the Savoy was so popular, it gave out cars, like sweepstakes. Hey, win this free car. That was apparently happening on a fairly regular basis in the first few years.
It's like Oprah prizes. Honestly.
Yeah.
It's just like Oprah was hosting the Savoy contest.
They had beauty contests. They had, This is actually a good time. So they had hostesses / taxi dancers. If y'all don't know what a taxi dancer is, basically a person could pay someone for a dance. And that was someone who was officially part of the ballroom staff. This is where we get into another rich area of conversation is the Savoy. First off, the Savoy was a classy joint, period. It was arguably classy for two very different reasons. So the first reason is because it was a classy joint. They felt Black Americans deserved to have a classy ballroom like the whites did downtown. They have respect for the community. These are reasons definitely why they wanted to run a classy venue. The other reason is that this is an integrated space where Black folks and white folks are mingling, where they could even potentially be touching each other, where they could potentially be leading to other things with each other. And so you have a society and the law enforcement that serves that society who are watching with laser eyes, looking for the first sign that something untoward is going on in this space. So the Savoy, after Prohibition, so it started in Prohibition, it did not sell alcohol, and they claimed it did not sell alcohol, unlike other places that you could go to in Harlem. Once Prohibition was done, they only served beer and wine. They did not serve hard alcohol, only beer and wine. So first off, that's a great way to kind of regulate the behaviors of your clientele. They also had a very strict no funny business policy. If you were causing a ruckus, if you were even cursing, you might be escorted out onto the street by the bouncer staff who was around often. And there were some women interviewed who understandably really appreciated how safe they could feel in the Savoy Ballroom under those behavior guidelines. Like they felt like if they were about to be harassed, they just had to wait a few seconds and then the problem would be taken care of. The taxi dancers, the Savoy put in the newspaper that the taxi dancers had gone to courtesy school.
Oh.
They basically the taxi dancers were not allowed to flirt with patrons. They were not allowed to accept drinks from patrons, and they certainly weren't allowed to date patrons or musicians.
Oh, wow.
You make you wonder if they tagged on the second one. There might be a story as to why they're like, and you can't date patrons. Next week. Okay, you can't date patrons or musicians.
Question. When you say taxi dancers, you're talking about both roles and also different gender.
That's a great question. I've not been able to find an answer for. All the pictures of the Savoy hostesses are all women.
Okay. Yeah, because when you were talking about the rules and regulations associated with that, that sounds like the policing of women's behaviors versus a general, like, any gender, please don't. Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Layers and layers and layers, Chisamo.
Mm-hmm.
As always.
Yes.
So, interestingly, Norma Miller went out of her way to say that she really appreciated it that the Savoy hostesses were all shades of black, not just light-skinned black, which she said was not at all the case for other parts of Harlem.
I imagine, I think she might have even made some comments to, she didn't say anything to me specifically about this, but I think she might have made some comments in the presence of some other of my friends who are different shades of black about this fact. I think it was notable to her because she was like, this was very apparent to her in all aspects of her career. She, with TV and so she's constantly seeing that there are black women who are being discriminated against and might have very talented black women, but if they're darker skinned, then I'm trying to think, did she say something to a specific person and say, you wouldn't have been allowed to be? I feel like one of my friends might. Anyway, sorry. All of that to say is that a lot of the black women that we know in the Lindy Hop community right now, maybe even including myself, wouldn't have been able to have jobs in this space because of how dark we are. So I think it was particularly apparent to her.
Where would you say, out of curiosity, where would you say Norma's color fell on that spectrum?
I think, wasn't she a little darker? Like, she was like light. I think she was light enough to be captured on film because she was in the different iconic films that we've seen. And then she also was on Sanford and Son, and the brown paper bag test, I think, has continued to impact Hollywood really through modern day. I would even say within the last 15, 20 years, we're just now seeing in the last 15, 20 years, more darker skinned black women with leading roles. With Sinners, I think is actually like a pretty significant, where we have a darker skinned, thicker woman who is a leading lady, and her role had nothing to do with either, which is so, but yeah, I think she was like maybe at the end of acceptable. She wasn't super light skinned. We're not talking about Josephine Baker light, but she was fairer than myself, and maybe I think she might have been like paper bag colored. Paper bag. Man. Yikes spikes. Anyway.
Yikes spikes indeed.
Yeah.
Here's a few lines from Christian Bachelor's book. When I started, there were about 50 girls, says Helen Clark, a former Savoy hostess. Before you were hired, Mr. Buchanan would check your family background, schooling, everything. According to Helen Clark, he kept a close eye on the hostesses because he feared that if one of the girls created a scandal, the Savoy would be closed. Since the hostesses were paid by the dance, they disliked bands playing long numbers. The prices later rose to 25 cents a dance, or $1 for 4. And originally they were 10 cents. So 10 cents is about $2. 25 cents is about $5. And so they would sell a pack of 4 of them, for $20. 1935 was the Harlem race riot of 1935. From that, you can assume that times were not great before then. But especially starting in that point, imagine kind of a general tension in Harlem. And when World War II started, those tensions increased a little bit. And especially as soldiers came home from the war and realized that they were still discriminated against, even though they had fought and many of them had died for the country. And a lot of them had been to European countries where they were treated a lot better than they were treated in their home country. Tensions grew even more throughout that era. And you get the sense, this is all from newspaper articles, so you have to kind of get a vibe from surrounding articles and from what you know about other things that have gone on around this time. But my impression is that this kind of tension was what led in 1943 to them basically trying to get Harlem clubs in trouble. And the Savoy was one of these Harlem clubs. And basically, if I recall correctly, it was the equivalent of someone asked a busboy where they could find some action, and the busboy told him to meet him in the bathroom, and he would hook them up with a pimp. And this is the action that got the Savoy closed down for a few months. Again, very dubious. You have no control over your bus person sending people to pimps in the bathroom.
Yeah.
That is not a fault on the business level, right?
Right. That is a reflection on that specific individual and not the establishment.
Yeah. And so thankfully the Savoy had enough clout and money to hire lawyers and get lawsuits involved and do all this kind of stuff that sped up the process of having them being able to open again in a few months' time. But the point is, there's evidence that their paranoia was correct, that like they had to be on incredibly good behavior in order to function in this society. The home of Happy Feet most likely comes from the actor Lana Turner, who, when she visited the Savoy, said something along the lines of, "Oh, such happy feet. Look at such happy feet." And so then it became the home of Happy Feet. The Savoy became really popular for celebrities to go to, and when they would go there, Herbert Whitey, who ran the Whitey's Lindy Hoppers out of the Savoy, would send his Lindy Hopper couples to go and personally entertain. Go over to Clark Gable's booth and dance for them.
Wow.
I mentioned Clark Gable specifically because Clark Gable was a regular at the Savoy, and Clark Gable was a really large appreciator of Black American and Black American arts, and also celebrities apparently really appreciated going to the Savoy because they weren't the object of attention at the Savoy. They could be more of themselves and not get hassled.
Yeah. That's wow. Savoy was the entertainer's entertainment.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
I think so.
That's cool.
Some other fun facts about the Savoy. The Shim Sham was not part of social dancing at the Savoy. And actually, I found out very recently that we almost certainly have Margaret Batachuk to thank for the Shim Sham being done in the modern scene. So Frankie Manning would teach the Shim Sham as part of his classes. And I recently did an interview with Margaret, and she mentioned that she was in Los Angeles and she happened to see Dean Collins and Bart Bartolo perform the Shim Sham. And she was like, "Oh, yeah, that's a great thing to just kind of do at a dance. Is just perform the Shim. We've all learned the Shim Sham. We might as well perform it." And so she asked Frankie if it was okay to like perform the Shim Sham. And he was like, "That's a great idea." And so they would start performing the Shim Sham.
Oh, this explains that. That makes sense.
Yeah, because if you don't know, folks, the Shim Sham is a way when all the tap dancers go out on stage, they can just do the Shim Sham as like an easy peasy throw together performance thing. One of the funny things that Margaret mentioned in the interview, which will hopefully be out online soon, Margaret mentioned that in the modern era, we tend to face the band when we do the Shim Sham, but originally it was done away from the band because the band is behind you while you're performing. So it was a performance.
It's a performance, yeah.
With the band.
Yeah.
Not to the band kind of thing.
And it makes sense also for I think my friend Danny Dowlers talked about the structure of the Shim Sham is more of a performance than like a line dance. I think we think of it as a line dance, but it's a performance that we've made be more of a line dance. Like we treat it like a line dance. I think for its preservation, but then also for a community. But it makes so much sense as a performance. Yeah.
So the Lindy Hoppers would train in the Savoy Ballroom during the day and during sound checks and stuff like that. And this happened throughout all generations of Whitey's Lindy Hoppers, and then the third generation, and then like the fourth generation. Sugar Sullivan, Barbara Billups, Sonny Allen, they all would practice at the Savoy. And this was when they were having their families and their kids, and they would bring their kids there. And so the Savoy was on the second floor, and it still didn't have air conditioning. And so the windows would always be open. And apparently the kids just loved to play near the open second-story windows. As your kid, you love that. Yeah, you're like, wait, that's cool. There's a second-story window out there. The other thing is, but the good news is they always had someone looking after the kids. They would take turns looking after the kids. And the other thing is that is one of my favorite a fun small fact. The kids' favorite thing was getting the ice out of the ice machine like treats.
Oh, yeah.
They were like, their treat for the day would be getting ice from the ice machine. The Savoy ceiling, I still need to find out how tall the Savoy ceiling was. When they would practice air steps, there was this, people would brag if they touched the ceiling. And so like Vicky Diaz, who was a Puerto Rican, I forgot who she won the Harvest Moon Ball with, but the first black and the first interracial Lindy Hop couple that we know of to win the Harvest Moon Ball was Vicky Diaz, who was Puerto Rican, and her partner, who was a Black American Harlem dancer. She touched the ceiling doing an air step, and that was like apparently that was like a big moment of pride for her. I think like her feet scraped against it. I mean, it looks tall, but it doesn't look too tall. So I don't think they're exaggerating when they say they touched the ceiling.
Yeah.
Or scraped it or something.
So like a Kemi could scrape the ceiling if you were throwing air with her.
Maybe.
Okay.
So in the 1950s, we're getting near the end of our Savoy story here. In the 1950s, I mentioned the tensions were getting worse after the war. We have 2 oral histories from hardcore non-black Savoy dancers from the 1940s. Mijia Simone, I might be mispronouncing her name, Italian-American, she won the Harvest Moon Ball in 1946. And Irene, the person I just recently interviewed, Jewish-American woman, they both visited the Savoy. They both were regulars at the Savoy. They both went there with groups of fellow friends from their neighborhoods and peer groups. And they both said that around the 1943-44, Harlem changed, and it didn't feel the same, and they kind of stopped going to the Savoy around that time. Neither of them blamed, like they were both very understanding about it. They're like, the people didn't change, just the feeling of the neighborhood changed, and so something about it made them feel like they maybe weren't welcome or that they shouldn't go there anymore. So first off, we know that the added tensions from the civil rights movement would continue to grow and be a part of Harlem. We also know that hard drugs, unfortunately, started to become a thing in all American cities after the war. And the places that are hit the worst by hard drugs are the lower class poverty, and there were lower class and poverty and stricken folks in Harlem. And so cities across America, this is when they started getting that real like unsafe vibe, was because of the hard drugs coming in post World War II. The Savoy didn't get as much tourism. Now, we know for a fact that there were still non-black dancers who did dance at the Savoy at that time. Lucky Cargo's a famous one. There are a few others who would go and compete in the Harvest Moon Ball and up until the 1950s and stuff, and they were there even in the last years of the Savoy Ballroom. We just know that there were apparently just a constant drop-off of white folks coming to the Savoy after the war. Now, that didn't stop the Savoy from doing its thing. They still won the Harvest Moon Ball every year. They still had generations of Lindy Hoppers coming in and growing and loving the space. They still had incredible music. They had an influx of new music with the Afro-Cuban movement. And so now you had new dance forms taking place on the Savoy dance floor. And around the last few years of the Savoy, there were always rumors that it was going to close. And part of that was because that the owners had been talking about trying to upscale it again, trying to get an even bigger, better space. So they apparently had been planning that for a few years. Finally, in 1958, they basically had to close the Savoy down to make way for housing projects that were in the area. That this was partially due to the Savoy owners making a deal with the city in order to give them the housing project land. The goal was to then go and build a bigger, better Savoy with the makings of that deal. They had one last party. People didn't know it was going to close until like a month before it closed. So they didn't have a long time to mourn. And they also had been promised a bigger, better Savoy Ballroom. Now, whether they believed it would happen or not, I'm sure not everyone did. I'm sure people were like, yeah, sure, I'll believe it when I see it. They had one last party, and they had a photographer go to that party. And so there's a pretty cool photo spread that I think you can find online, folks, called Slaughter at the Savoy. Slaughter at the Savoy. It's an artistic title, not a... and it's just full of pictures of great air steps and people looking unimpressed at the air steps.
And just to get a beat on the timeline. So World War II ended in 1945. The civil rights movement started in 1954. When we're talking about closing the doors in 1958, the civil rights movement had been rolling for a few years. So they were in the throes of that, the upward trajectory, which then also brings in this other factor of like there's like political forces probably behind things as well. Wasn't there a law that was passed about dancing?
The cabaret law.
Yes.
The cabaret law. Man, that is something to someone that I should absolutely know about.
So
and I do not.
we're going to wait with bated breath.
All right. The cabaret law. Here's a quick down and dirty. It began in the Prohibition era, and it was actually began as a way to make sure that places didn't get overly crowded with folks, thus causing a fire hazard or other occupancy hazards. But of course, cabaret laws were notoriously used against jazz and places where black and white folks mixed in order to get clubs shut down or to make life really hard for them. It was finally repealed just a few years ago in New York City. But yes, the cabaret laws is a easy way for them to close down dancing and music, especially if they don't like that dancing or music or what it implies.
Yeah, and so the cabaret law also happened around this time. So there were a number of forces, as you mentioned, socially within Harlem, because the thing that I appreciate about this story is that you were saying from the outset, we have this idea that New York City is this like metropolitan place with progressive ideas, and it's always been that way. And it wasn't, because it's an important part of the U.S.'s financial body in the 19th century. Then we get into the 20th century, and so that hasn't completely gone. You have Harlem, which has a mixture of all of these racial ties already, these like cultural community conflicts. We have this like seeming artistic resolution with the Savoy Ballroom and this like beautiful story of the Harlem Renaissance and like the Savoy being a place where artists come together, where we have this integrated experience once a week, all the races come together and dance. But underneath there is this probably continuous like bubbling of unrest and tension. And then after the war, that is no longer underneath the surface. We're able to see it, probably experience it a little bit more. And then you have the closing of the Savoy Ballroom. So there's all these different forces at play that we think like, oh, this was a great place and everything was amazing. People danced and incredible art happened, and then it stopped. And we're like, why did it stop? And these are all these really important pieces that led to it stopping.
And unfortunately, the sadness of the story doesn't just end with the closing of the Savoy Ballroom. The closing of the Savoy Ballroom meant there was a deal with Mo Gale and Charles Buchanan and some other folks involved as part of the project that was going to happen. And a article came out soon after the closing of the Savoy Ballroom that was called, "Why Did They Squeeze Buchanan Out of the Mid-Harlem Project?" So this is an entry paragraph quoted verbatim. "Negroes found themselves squeezed out of another lucrative plum last week as evidence uncovered in the current Title I scandal revealed that former Savoy Ballroom manager Charles Buchanan was bypassed as a possible Title I builder for no apparent good reason." This article then continues to say there's no other reason than racism is pushing this black manager out of the deal that was supposed to happen coming on with the closing of the Savoy Ballroom. So in the place of the Savoy, they put up housing projects, which are now apartments. And so you could, if you wanted to, folks, you could go live in an apartment on the grounds that the Savoy was on. And they have pictures and stuff of Lindy hopping from the Savoy in their apartment buildings. I've had friends who've lived there and have gotten to be inside the building. Now, they also have famously the plaque out in front, which a lot of folks have been to or at least seen on the internet. To finish our story, we're going to talk about a person named Louise Parks, aka Mama Lou Parks. So Mama Lou Parks was in Boston in college, and during the summers, she would come down to New York and spend time with her godfather, who was Charles Buchanan. And so this is probably where she first got her exposure to the Savoy Ballroom. Now, after she graduated college in Boston, she was thinking she would either be involved in ministry or theater. And she moved to New York and started working at the Savoy. Some history say as a coat check person, but if she was Charles Buchanan's goddaughter, she also the kind of person that she is, I would imagine she probably did quite a few jobs around the Savoy. She seems to be the kind of person who gets shit done, and very quickly people recognize she gets shit done, and so they ask her to get shit done. And so I would be shocked if she spent her time only as a coat check person. So she's working at the Savoy, and during the day, she's teaching dance to public school kids. So she becomes a teacher in a public school teaching program for dance. She gets assigned to Harlem PS School 68, PS for public school, and she is supposed to teach these kids square dancing, which I've been told by some has kind of a weird racist tone to it. Like, on the one hand, square dancing is also a Black American, like all American art forms, it is also a Black American art form. And there's even evidence to suggest that Virginia Reel and calling those things in the first place was originally a Black American art form. The Black American MC would call the dance steps and help people know what was coming up. And it would also give them a chance to show how eloquent they were and to say lots of fun, cool stuff, as you can imagine, in the Black American tradition. Anyway, point being, square dancing is probably more Black American than we realize. However, the people probably didn't realize that when they tried to really push for square dancing to be a partnership dancing in the public schools of New York as kind of a white cultural thing. Like that was, they were going for a white cultural partner dance. So I've heard that's why Louise Parks why there was a square dancing teaching program in the public schools of New York. I can't say anything more than that's what someone told me. However, Mama Louise looked at the young, fresh Black faces of Harlem looking up at her, and she said, I got to teach these kids Lindy Hop. And so she taught them Lindy Hop instead of square dancing. Now, this did a few things. First off, this ushered in the next generation of Lindy Hopper. Like, Mama Lou Parks always had the next generation of Lindy Hoppers coming up because she was always teaching the kids Lindy Hop. And so when they would grow up, old enough to do the Harvest Moon Ball, they would do the Harvest Moon Ball. Boom, new generation of Lindy Hoppers. Check. PS 68 was also a community center at night. So during the day it was a school, during the night it was a community center. And so when the Savoy closed, she used her access to that space to continue the Lindy Hop program, to continue training Lindy Hoppers, to basically continue everything that the Savoy had to offer dancing, except for live bands. Anyway, in 1961, so 1958 Savoy closes, 1961, 3 years later, Lindy Hop of the Savoy Ballroom has been living almost strictly through the other clubs in Harlem and Mama Lou Parks' work at the Public School 68. 1961, there's a fraternal temple in the Bronx. Think like a Masonic temple, that kind of thing, like a temple of a fraternal organization in the Bronx that is bought, and they slap Savoy Manor on it. And so the next Savoy Ballroom that was promised is not the bigger, better, grander thing in Harlem. It's taking a space that exists in Bronx and turning that into the next Savoy Ballroom. They call it the Savoy Manor. And so the spirit of the Savoy lives on in the Savoy Manor, mainly, it seems like, because Mama Lou now has the Savoy Manor as the home base. And now there's live bands. Now there's her continuing the Lindy Hop program there. One of the big things she would do is she would hold the Harvest Moon Ball prelims, which used to be held at the Savoy. She would hold it at the Savoy Manor, and she took charge of holding it at the Savoy Manor. And so it seems in the history books that Mama Lou she saw Herbert Whitey and what he had done, and she's like, I can do that for the next generation. She saw Charles Buchanan, her godfather, and how he ran the Savoy, and was like, I can do that for the next generation. And so she took on the role of two different, very busy human beings. She started Mama Lou Parkettes, the famous dance team, because swing music wasn't the most popular thing in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. They would do go-go dancing, soul dancing, but popular music dancing. And yet she would still continue to train all the dancers that she saw in Lindy Hop. And so Mama Lou Parks group famously would do all the Black American social dances of the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. And they would do Lindy Hop as passed down from the Savoy Ballroom. The Savoy Manor was also home to some really important hip-hop things, right? Like a lot of hip-hop history comes out of the Bronx. And the big venue, one of the big venues in the Bronx that these hip-hop parties or hip-hop events would happen at was the Savoy Manor. So even though the Savoy Ballroom, for us Lindy Hoppers, we think of that as a thing of Lindy Hop, the spirit of the Savoy beautifully transitioned into the next Black American music and dance form of hip hop.
Yeah. And here you see the direct lineage of Lindy Hop to hip hop. And yet another reason why I really hope that the Lindy Hoppers, who are particularly those who are white, listen to what I'm about to say. This is why it's important to respect and appreciate Black American art. Black art as a whole. I'm here as a Zambian. I'm not going to say don't listen to us, don't get down with us. I'm not going to say that. But I do think that we have a tendency in our communities to kind of jettison Black Americans and Black American art for other things like Afrobeats or Amapiano or house or these other styles, not realizing that they all, like when we think about house and Amapiano and even Afrobeats, those are also directly tied to these African American dance forms. Like we wouldn't have Amapiano or Afrobeats if we didn't have hip hop and rock. It's the intersection of African music from modern day Africa with the music of the diaspora. And so it's so important. In order for us to recognize and appreciate the spirit of the Savoy, to appreciate the spirit of Lindy Hop, we have to appreciate the entrepreneurial spirits and the incredible people that came from these communities, these Black Americans. One of the other things is like Mama Lou Parks is out here being like all iconic Black women who do the jobs of 500 people. Like she's out here continuing this legacy and being she's like, oh, you didn't own that? Well, I'm about to own something.
Yeah. Yeah. And folks, because we spent a lot of time setting up the story of the Savoy, and, when we think of Herbert Whitey as like this super important figure in Lindy Hop, which he is, absolutely he is. Herbert Whitey's time kind of shaping and molding dancers was mostly within a decade and possibly 2 decades. Like, you give him 2 decades. Mama Lou Parks started in the mid-50s doing this thing of like taking the dance and preserving it for the next generation, And she did that until her death in 1990. So that's already 35 years, if my math is correct.
Yeah. Almost 4 decades.
Yeah, almost 4 decades of dedication to this. And she would have continued to go onward had she not died before her time at the age of 60. So she passed away from complications involving diabetes, I believe, a month after she got off a cruise tour with her group, the Parkettes. And so she was still working hard and would have been working hard into the 90s, possibly the 2000s,
Yeah. This also, you might wonder why it's important to support Black businesses. Like, you can see a thing that we love, that we give credit to the Black community, was owned primarily by a Jewish individual. And a lot of the things that Black Americans have been able to do have often not been owned by them. And so it's really powerful when Black Americans are able to own establishments and have thriving businesses, because if we look at history with an honest lens, anytime Black Americans create something, own something, it gets destroyed somehow. And usually there are political forces and social cultural forces that are supporting that. I would just really quickly, thinking about Tulsa and Black Wall Street, that was and Rosewood, these are communities that were burned to the ground, that were destroyed. So when we look at people who are able to, oftentimes I think people may not even quite put words to this, but when you see Black Americans engaging with Lindy Hop and maybe struggling to find a way to belong or own a thing that is theirs, there's so many complicated social, cultural, and political aspects to things. And so it's so important for us to advocate and not just create space, but listen to Black voices. And so I just see these themes echoed through your story, Bobby. It's so it's really important to me that we really take time to examine these things.
Something that I'm still trying to process as I was putting all this material together, the thing that kind of struck me at the end is that because it was in Harlem and it had Charles Buchanan managing it, Black American businessman, and because it had Herbert Whitey, Black American entrepreneur, as one of the main drivers of his staff, because it had, from the way it looks to me, this was a Black space that invited white people to be a part of it to certain degrees or whatever. In contrast to the modern Lindy Hop scene, which is a white space that is trying to come to terms with it being a white space and trying to come to terms with inviting Black people into it to be a part of it, to course correct was the word in my head. I don't think that's the best word, but to make it a place that it can, be truer to its original self.
No, but I think these are the types of reflections I think we need to be having, right? So there's also the question of something I've heard folks say that I appreciate is when Black folks come to the realization that they don't have to be invited in, that it is actually their space and it is actually their dance. This is one of those, there are multiple things that are true at the same time. The fact that you have a space that is majority white and organized by white folks, like makes it inherently white, but the legacy, the dancing, the origins are Black. So there's an identity war that I think is constantly happening, and there's grappling there that's taking place from multiple perspectives. There are folks who I know they're white professionals who've like entirely stepped away and been like, this isn't for me. But then there's also the understanding that of this notion that Latasha Barnes has like written about and talked about, which is this notion of this. She might have even coined the phrase cultural surrogacy.
Yeah, I think she did.
And so this idea that as the Mamalu Park story is compelling because it's a story of continuation, and it indicates that there was never a time where the Black community did not have Lindy Hop. And I think that that's a really important story. The parallel story is of the majority, the dominant culture being brought into an awareness of Lindy Hop. And so from that perspective, from the majority perspective, it looks like Lindy Hop is something that went away and then came back. And the people who live in that space are the ones who have propagated swing dancing. And so the spaces that we go into are often owned and marketed by those individuals.
In a lot of ways, I've recently been feeling like multiple things can be true at the same time is a great catchphrase for our show here.
It is. It's who we are. We're acknowledging and recognizing the complex and simultaneous truths.
Yeah. I was going to say, we have to be careful of nostalgia. I think we're doing better at this as a scene recently. I hope we continue to get better at this. When we think of the Savoy Ballroom, we have to be careful of thinking of the Savoy Ballroom through a nostalgic lens and only of like, oh, wow, this great harmonious thing that had incredible music and where the best Lindy hopping in the world took place. And yes, we can certainly have some level of nostalgia for that beautiful image. But, as we reflect on 100 years of the Savoy, how do we take whatever inspiration we have from the Savoy and use it to help us find a better path for ourselves in the modern scene?
Yeah. Oh, that's a beautiful thought. Yeah.
But I have absolutely no answers, though.
Yeah. That question feels like it's in line with the spirit of Mamalu Parks. One of the ways I could see this story is that she was tasked with teaching a folk dance, because square dancing is often marketed as such. Like, let's do a folk dance that is clean and pure and all these different things. And she thought, well, let's do a folk dance that actually relates to these people, that is their dance. And so her efforts came out of a space of preserving her community. And so there's this question of like, how can we live in that spirit and preserve that community? But I think when we're in a space that has an identity crisis, the question is, and then now if we're looking at the history of quote unquote the revival and all of that, that is now also like the revival is essentially a vintage concept now too, because it was how many years ago now? Almost 40 years ago, 40 years ago. I know it's real gross considering our ages. We're like, what are you talking about? That anyway, Bobby and I are both millennials, and so we're used to millennials, meaning the young ones, and we get it, Gen Z, and your yik yak and your young things, whatever. A student was telling me about social medias that I don't know about the other day, and she was like, yeah, and then they went off on me on Yik Yak and this and that, and I'm like, oh my god. Anyway, sorry. So
what, you're not on Foombar? Oh, never mind.
Exactly.
Yeah,
no.
pretend I didn't say anything.
Man. But like the time when that came up in the 80s and 90s, like that's now been far enough away that we can sit in nostalgia and reflect on that vintage idea. But is it better to celebrate the echoes of something that the majority community has found to be exciting because it celebrates aspects, like aesthetic aspects that they enjoy, or is it better to actually celebrate a community, an embodied community? And I mean, I'm on the side of really digging into the true communities where this came from, Black American communities, but then also like there are people whose families had swing dances. Like, let's actually get to the truth and the meat of that versus like a Hollywood interpretation of a thing.
Yeah. For me, I think that reminded me when I talked to folks about the Harlem scene versus the Southern California scene, for instance. So the Southern California scene, for those who don't know, huge swing dancing scene, really important. They invented dances like Balboa and swing/bow swing. They created whole new versions of Lindy Hop. They were a scene that had tons of Black American influence, as well as most likely Latin American, Asian American, like it's a real melting pot of a city. When I talk to people about the difference between the Harlem swing dance experience and the Southern California swing dance experience, one of the biggest things that sticks out for me is the difference between a generational cultural art form and a trend that is picked up. So the Southern Californian scene, these, no matter what color, they were teenagers and 20-somethings who were getting into this cool new swing jazz coming from the East Coast. And so as far as we know, there wasn't any like Elder Charleston dancers. There wasn't any Shorty Georges and Mattie Purnells dancing in the late 20s in Southern California that the teenagers would see on the dance floor and get notes from and get to know. They didn't pass their dance on to a next generation who passed it. Harlem, Black cultural art form. It was passed from Shorty George's and Mattie Purnell's generation to Frankie Manning and Norma Miller's generation. It was passed on to Sugar Sullivan and Sonny Allen's generation, which was passed on to the Mama Lou Parks dancing generation, David Butts, Debbie Youngblood, which was passed on to Crystal Johnson and Joya Jane. Like the whole, like it was passed on. You would go dancing in the Savoy Ballroom, and yes, you had to be 18 to enter, but after that, you could go. And so you would go to the Savoy Ballroom, and there would be people in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. It's clearly mentioned that there were people of all different ages in the Savoy Ballroom. And so when I look at the dance scene today, we're kind of in between the two. Like, we have different generations of dancers. We have 20-somethings, 30-somethings, 40s. Like, there are people of different ages on our dances. But I don't know if people of all different ages feel super excited and warmed and welcomed into our space. Just like I don't know if people who aren't white feel super welcome and invited into the space.
I think that these are really good. It boils down to a sense of belonging and ownership. Like, who's entitled to take up space, own this, add creative energy, provide mentorship, who is listened to. And I think the story of the Savoy brings us, like, puts into focus these questions and puts into focus, like, who gets to own the Savoy, who gets to own the story of Lindy Hop, and how do we continue to tell that story? So I think all of those things are valid and important for us to kind of nibble on as we celebrate 100 years of the Savoy.